That
Hello,
means we're
everybody,
live.
and welcome. Sorry, I thought that's what I thought. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of React 30, the podcast all about React, where we promise not to waste more than 30 minutes of your time. And this week's episode, I am your co-host, Michael Jackson. Joining us today is our producer and co-host, Kent C. Dodds.
Hello.
And Ryan P. Florence.
Hey.
who has apparently checked out of civilized society and is now living somewhere in the forest with a... Oh, geez, is that Bear Lake?
Yep, I'm at Bear Lake.
Oh, that's amazing.
Wow. Totally jealous.
Yeah, and
Oh,
I
geez.
still know how to wakeboard.
Oh,
Water
man.
yesterday, I was throwing back flips, front flips. Gave myself a headache trying to 360.
Sick, dude.
Yeah.
Sick. That sounds like a ton of fun.
Yeah, you're 2.5
So our
years away.
special guest this week... Oh, yeah. So our special guest this week is Jason Miller. Say hi, Jason.
Hi. I'm not going to do Dustin's thing. Hi.
You might know Jason as Develop It on Twitter and GitHub. Jason is the author of a really cool kind of React alternative called Preact with a P. So anyway, we're gonna get a chance to talk about that much later, or not much later. Hopefully not much later. I met Jason for the first time. I think it was in my npm CDN project where I was doing some stuff, and Jason showed up, and he was like, "Hey, I'm using this as well. This is kind of cool." So we kind of met over there, and then we're doing a few other things. He likes to troll me. He likes to make PRs that troll me and stuff. So I appreciate that, Jason. So Jason, just as kind of an intro. Oh, by the way, I'm doing this week's timer using JavaScript's set timeout function. And Chrome has told me that it refused to evaluate a string as JavaScript because unsafe eval is not allowed, source of script in the following content security policy directive. Stuff just used to be so easy on the web, and now I get messages like this, and I don't know what they mean anymore. So I ignore that. You're our timer again this week, Kent.
All right, I'll figure it out.
All right. So Jason, why don't you give us kind of the bird's eye view of Preact and kind of how it came to be? I guess you started it out as kind of like a VDOM library. So why don't you give us the kind of elevator sales pitch about Preact and what it is?
Cool. So depending on the length of the elevator, I change the pitch. The short one is if you're a developer in a situation where you might find it difficult or impossible to use React, there's a bunch of different cases like embedded widgets and these types of things. If it's not quite a perfect fit for you, it might be that you can use Preact and still have most of the same functionality and that same sort of that same interface as React. So it's kind of an attempt to take what makes React easy to use and learn and very useful and boil that down into as tiny of a JavaScript library as possible. So that's kind of the pitch. It's a lot more specific than React. There's very little metaprogramming or anything that goes on, and it is definitely specific to web and to the HTML DOM. Yeah, its goal is to be small, but still encompass as much of the React public API as possible.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's pretty small. In fact, I was able to read through almost all of the source code in just a few hours this morning, just kind of browsing through and saw a lot of the kind of elements that I was familiar with from browsing through React's own source code, things like the render queue and stuff like that, and just saw those in Preact source code. So that was actually pretty cool. If you've ever kind of been intimidated by the React source code, it might be kind of maybe a little more approachable, just because it is less code. So cool. So it's tiny, and then you've got also this kind of extreme focus on performance. So that's is it wrong to say that?
No, it's definitely correct. The way this started out, it was a code pen. I was doing animations of a bunch of different DOM elements, just as like divs mocking as circles. And I wanted to see if, for this given demo, I could avoid using Canvas. So I was creating and deleting DOM elements in a request animation frame loop and styling them, in a rainbow or whatever. Just a silly kind of a code pen thing. But I just started off with a really specific diff, not actually diffing the DOM, but diffing, these objects. They were called cursor for some reason. And that kind of evolved into a really basic attribute diff, and then obviously the creation and deletion of things as part of the animation necessitated, a creation and deletion diff. And I started to add in all of these various pieces. And after I added in the reordering diffing, or at least a very naive version of reordering diffing, it started to not approach necessarily where React's diff was, because diffing to DOM is kind of a weird case. It's not a very deterministic thing to diff. You can have nodes with properties that are objects, and you're not really going to serialize those to try and create nice keys to diff. That's where the key attribute comes in.
Yes.
But so I ended up with this algorithm that was at least, for a lot of use cases, probably sufficient to do basic diffing. You can measure that by, rendering a couple of things, and then adding a watch to create element and set attribute and all these various DOM methods, and then seeing if you go and render previous versions, how many DOM operations are being performed. And once I got that, those numbers down low enough that it seemed like there was no extra work being done, I realized that I could probably just publish this diff algorithm. That standalone would have been fairly similar to Matt, I want to say Ike, I don't know his last name, his virtual DOM library. His is maybe a little bit more fully featured there because it's hyper-focused on just that diff.
So you weren't like set out to make a React alternative at this point. You were just doing something fun and then realized, oh, a React-like thing just showed up in my code pen.
Right.
Maybe I should explore this.
Yeah, and so that's where I say it sort of came from performance. I was doing animation first. I wasn't really thinking necessarily about rendering user interfaces with this. But as it started to grow, it never really grew beyond the confines of what I was able to manage in a code pen. I mean, 800 lines into code pen is maybe a little bit long, but it's really not that bad. Even at that point, I think it was about 500 lines. Yeah, I know. You can tell I used to program everything in one file. But
I put the
so
whole JS bin once.
Oh yeah.
I like it. I like that style.
It's rapid prototyping, right? And I get some points at the end that I wanted to make about that,
Exactly.
Relating back to the React community. But so it never really grew beyond that size, and I started thinking maybe there's a bunch of cases, like I know I'd certainly run into stuff where, let's say I'm developing a library for doing authentication, and it needs to show a pop-up with some available auth providers or whatever, and let you pick a few things. But really, like it's a small piece of user interface. It might benefit from a diff, but it certainly doesn't warrant bringing in all of React. Like this is a one modal kind of a thing. And if it was possible to try and pull some of those core values from React out into something that's really tiny, you might be able to use Preact where you would normally have to go vanilla JavaScript or direct DOM manipulation. And to me, that's a big gain because it's a lot more maintainable to maintain something that is built on top of a known abstraction, even if the implementation is different.
Absolutely.
So I can jump between a React code base and this tiny module that just happens to have some user interface, but the concepts are still the same. The code is either fully portable or ridiculously easy to port by swapping out some imports.
So on that, like the implementation being totally different. So other than like what you mentioned, how this is like specific to the web, like why wouldn't I just always use Preact? Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because like it sounds like it's smaller, it's faster. What are some of the other reasons why I might want to use React instead?
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously, it's easy for me to list reasons why you might. I certainly use it in my day job and all my side stuff. But there's reasons why it's maybe easier for me as the author to just say, oh yeah, I'll just use the thing that I wrote because I fully understand it. I'm one of those people that likes to see and feel how things work, and so that was kind of what took Preact from just a virtual DOM library to trying to emulate a lot of what React does, is studying the React code base. And there's a series of articles called Understanding React and Re-implementing it from Scratch that somebody wrote. I wish I had the link. I don't. They are fantastic articles, and they kind of helped me transition this into something that I would consider using in production. But really, like there's a couple other things. So in going between React and a raw virtual DOM library, I think the thing that I missed the most, because I tend to use component state at least at first, and then consider things like Redux. The thing that I missed the most was linked state. I find it helps reduce the number of manually written event handlers, basically just trying to get values back out of the DOM into your component state. And so one of the big differences that Preact has from React in terms of the API is it ships with a linked state, not mix-in, but a linked state method hanging off of component that you can call. And so it basically just creates an event handler for you that persists a value from the DOM back into state. And I found that useful. There was a couple other really nitpicky things. So there's a really long saga of why React uses class name and not class. And I read that saga and I understand it, but that was long after I chose to use class. And it's really interesting to watch that play out, because now React is kind of moving very slowly in baby steps back towards attributes from properties, not necessarily for the actual diffing algorithm, but for their nomenclature and for the way the way people understand how JSX attributes work. So yeah, one of the differeces would be that it prefers class over class name, though it will accept both. And there's a couple niceties. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, we've touched on a few points already that I think are actually really, really interesting. How Preact is kind of it's almost kind of way into areas, I think, right? Like this.
Hey, hold it. Is Michael super scratchy for anybody else?
Yeah, it's robot Michael time right now.
Yeah, it could be feedback from everybody else, so make sure to mute yourself when you're not talking.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm turning off my video. Does that help?
Go ahead and turn your video back on. I bet it was one of us.
Oh, okay. Is that okay?
You sound great.
Okay, so I was just going to say,
Great.
we've touched on a few points here where it seems like Preact, obviously you have a smaller user base with Preact, right? You don't have all these existing kind of quote-unquote legacy applications, massive users to support. So you can make changes, you can move a little bit more quickly, and break things, as Facebook is fond of saying. So you've got a few things that we've talked about. You're diffing against actual DOM, which I know is something that React actually wants to do eventually. You're making this move to using HTML attribute names instead of DOM property names, which given the nature of JSX, lots of people, when they get some JSX into their code base, they're kind of confused, like, why do I have to use the class name thing? And in fact, Ryan and I in our training workshops, we have to teach people, hey, look, this is the DOM property name, and it's not a big thing. So it seems like in a few ways you're kind of able to say, let's take like this React model, which is great. I prefer an abstraction. I want the virtual DOM, but I've got a few nits with it. Like I've got a few improvements that I could make with it. I saw a conversation between you. Just a brief conversation, you, Jason, and Sebastian Mark Beige, who's we're going to get him on the show in just a few weeks here, but on Twitter, where you were talking about the scheduling of I think it was specifically the scheduling of the startup, the way that React boots on the page, and you're talking about using different methods for scheduling. You're using I think a message channel where they're using some sort of set timeout or something right now. So it seems like in a lot of ways, like, you can sort of experiment with things and maybe move a little bit, just be a little bit more agile, move a little bit faster, break stuff, because you don't have this really large user base. And then it seems like, if the communication channel is open, like some of these ideas can actually be ported back into React Core. Is that inaccurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I've had a couple. I'm obviously like super arm's reach from anything happening in React Core, but I've definitely had some conversations with them. Even things like when they were finally able to drop the wrapping spans around text nodes. That was something that but when I was just looking at that original optimization of a virtual DOM diffing algorithm. Not only did I eschew wrapping text nodes and spans, but I actually also collapsed text nodes manually before the DOM has to do that using normalize. And I'm hoping that what I can show in Preact, where I do have that smaller user base, I have more focus just on web. Like React, when they make a change in React Core, has to worry about the 300 different renderers that might exist and be relying on some crazy constraint about that.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot of baggage, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they have a lot of users, a lot of different use cases, right? Their use cases vary more because their targets vary more, and Preact doesn't necessarily have to deal with that. So when I talk about it not having the to deal with legacy APIs and that kind of stuff, it's not just APIs. It's even just legacy use cases, stuff from React 0.13 just doesn't exist here. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. I don't mean to say that I think React is moving slowly or anything. I think React actually is moving very, very quickly, especially for a project of its size and popularity and deployment. But I do think that we do need some sort of breathing room. We do need some space to sort of experiment, get out there and try new things. The React authors actually had a React Future repo that they were doing a lot of work on, kind of in this same vein, like, exploring things, that they could possibly do in the future. So I think it's really cool that there's sort of, instead of, just sort of theorizing about it, there's an actual, implementation here that we can sort of, play around with and do things with. So kudos for that. That's really cool.
Yeah, and I wonder whether, like, React Future is awesome. It's definitely good to get those ideas down on paper. My thinking around that is if I can make or improve the approachability of Preact as a code base, it's possible that might be an easier place to do these sort of wild experimentations. Like, one example would be I switched the the queuing to be powered by promises because it's the tightest async you can do in a browser. And in noticing that, I turned on full async rendering. So when you set a component's props, when you render a child, it's actually not synchronous anymore. And the effect was it clips the stack trace for that deep recursion algorithm that is the reconciliation. And for whatever reason, I guess just because function calls are expensive and there's lots of context being created, doing that in a tight promise loop is actually faster and leads to better frame rate than just doing it using straight recursion. So whatever the semantics are of promise.resolve.then, there is some serious promise there at the very least in Chrome. That's why that's not turned on by default in Preact yet. Is if you don't have promises installed.
You said there's some serious promise there. That was slick.
So I actually have a question about that. How do you benchmark Preact?
Yeah, so that's actually one kind of evolving thing. I have a couple obviously apps that I run locally, and I just npm link Preact into them and make sure stuff's not broken. That's more aside from unit tests. That's kind of my larger integration test suite is, hey, did this break Preact MDL, which is sort of this ungodly mess of a third-party library integration? And usually if something's broken in Preact, it will break the heck out of Preact MDL. Material design light, by the way. But the main way that I actually look at performance, I have some baseline tests that run as part of my unit tests, and there's actually like high watermark values that if it goes over that, the tests will fail. And those obviously get adjusted depending on whether code coverage is enabled and that kind of stuff. But basically, I measure, some baseline information about how fast the JavaScript environment is able to execute, kind of trying to come up with a tick value. And then I run things like a diff of two identical V trees to see what the overhead of the algorithm was when there's actually no DOM operations being performed, and that should be obviously very fast, many, many, many hundreds of thousands per second kind of thing. And then I do things like render problematic components like stateful elements, like inputs and that kind of stuff where you might write JSX attributes and they get persisted out to the DOM as some other type, or there's some sort of an intrinsic transformation that happens there, the checked attribute or whatever, and the possibility there for that to accidentally break by Preact accidentally checking the DOM property versus your previously set JSX attribute. That's obviously a high possibility there. So I have kind of litmus tests in the unit tests that make sure that those things don't go wrong. And then obviously on top of that, everybody knows there's the VDOM benchmark by local void. That's a big one. It's has 10 or 20 different virtual DOM frameworks on there. It's not so great for comparing across frameworks because the semantics are very different, right? React doesn't recycle DOM elements, which is one huge difference from how Preact works. Preact desperately tries not to create new nodes. It will reuse nodes at all costs, and that's because I'm trying to get it to run in constant memory once an app has been navigated around a bit. But in checking between versions, so load up the current mainline version of Preact and then load up my local copy in UI bench. It's a good way to see line by line, when rearranging 500 rows in a table, how long does that take or whatever, and then it gives you an overall value for just the total time taken to run through all the tests, and that's an absolutely indispensable tool for monitoring performance regressions. You're making sure that the diff algorithm didn't accident, you change an index or whatever, and it completely destroys the performance of deletes. It can happen really good.
Awesome. It's so incredibly obvious to me that you've put like a ton of thought into this at a very detailed level. So that's really, really cool. Kudos for that, Jason. I noticed that there are just a few things, and since this show is so limited on time, I'm sorry, you probably feel like we're flying at 20,000 feet right now, which we are. We just have to just hit on a few points. There's a compatibility layer, right? Preact compat, and that's compatibility with core React, right? So just for somebody who's might be interested in thinking about this, maybe is that for people who are transitioning maybe a code base for an existing code base from React to Preact? Is that what that's for?
Yeah, it's bidirectional. So if you have a React code base, it is quite likely that you could either through Webpack or Browserify or whatever alias React and React DOM out for Preact compat, and it should still run. If it's not, that's a bug. There's a couple little caveats to do with modules that reach into React's undocumented internals or sort of unintended public internals sometimes, and I'm working on replacements for those. But there's issues where it's actually not going to be possible in some cases. But yeah, it's either for people coming from React to Preact, or somebody looking to optimize their production bundle, by compiling it against Preact, or the other way around. If you want to write React code, capital R React code, but you want to use Preact, you just alias it out for Preact compat, write your code as if you were using React, and for the most part, you shouldn't care or ever notice. It does tend to get slightly hairy. Yeah. It's been a kind of a work in progress because there's the React API and then there's the React API, like the rest of the iceberg, test utils and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So that one's definitely a work in progress. But
that's awesome. I noticed you actually do have kind of an officially blessed Preact boilerplate, which all of us here on this show, we're all huge fans of Webpack, and that's a Webpack powered thing. So that's actually really, really cool. That's something that many in the React community have kind of attempted to solve, and I don't know if in fact Ryan actually has the React project thing he's worked on. It's cool just to have some kind of direction from the top about, okay, this is how you might want to actually build a full project, in Preact. Anything to say about the boilerplate there?
Yeah, I mean, I put the boilerplate out there because obviously, like, all my stuff's powered by Webpack, and I kind of wanted to show, like, hey, if I was going to start a new Preact project, this is pretty much where I'm starting from. Unless it's something crazy off the wall like an Electron app. But the one thing I kept getting was, how do I enable hot module replacement? How do I work with CSS modules with Preact? And a lot of that has nothing at all to do with Preact at all. Those are Webpack questions. So Preact boilerplate is kind of my contribution to, like, okay, yes, it serves as a starter point if you just want to build a web app or a website with Preact, but also here's a pretty simple Webpack configuration that enables both of those two things. And I guess one thing about boilerplates for me, I really want to see them kind of go away. They're kind of confusing. I don't like the idea of forking and then forgetting.
Absolutely. Agreed.
Like, certainly internal at Cinecore, we don't use them. We have command line tools that wrap around all of our infrastructure like that. So you kind of take a command line tool with you through your development workflow, and it's just a semver link between you and how things work.
Yeah.
And I know that's similar to Ryan's thing.
I think they're just primarily like a stepping stone, right? Or just, we all want to get there, and yeah, they're just stepping stone. Ryan, you look like you wanted to say something.
Ryan, you're muted. I think your mic is muted.
How's that? Is that better? Let's have it.
Darn scratchy there, bud.
It's scratchy?
Just the trees.
How about that? Is that better?
It's pretty much just as bad.
Just as bad?
Oh, that's better.
That's a little better. That's better.
This is better. Sorry about that. I was having mic problems earlier. Okay, so we look back at, like, history of JavaScript, and we've got underscore, and then Lodash shows up because, if I remember right, I'm sure people might remember this better than me, that there were some performance improvements that a handful of people, mostly John David Dalton, wanted to make to underscore, but underscore wouldn't accept those changes. So they went ahead and said, well, let's make our own thing, call it Lodash, and now, like, it totally took over, and it's what everybody uses. Is that your goal with Preact, or what is your goal with Preact?
No, it's definitely not the goal. So Preact is never going to address the alternative renderer use case. You'll never see a Preact native. It's just not going to happen. Since the mission there is to just be the simplest possible implementation if you're going web and only web, it's always going to be pigeonholed to that use case, and I'm totally fine with that. I don't want to have to cater to the the other 50% of that battle or more. So I don't ever see it even competing with React's market share, if you'll call it that.
Well, and there's a whole, like, third-party sort of ecosystem of, there's React 3 and React Canvas and, like, all these other sort of things that, for you to try and say this is also my concern would just bog you down and take a ton of extra effort and stuff. So
yeah,
it's already hard enough to keep up with.
No, absolutely.
That's one thing that underscore didn't have. Like, I mean, there were mix-ins, but that was pretty easy for Lodash to add in. So I've got to say that we have just 2 minutes left, and I believe, Jason, that you had a couple of things you wanted to bring up at the end of our conversation. Was there anything else in particular you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, just future of React stuff. So there's a couple things that that I am looking at pulling into Preact that I would really like React itself to also adopt. Obviously, pure component is coming. That's kind of a train that's already set in motion. And then kind of shortly thereafter, memoization of pure functional components. So you have the same should component update false optimizations for pure functions as you would for classes. Because really, I think we should be trying to treat functions as the first class citizen and classes kind of as a second, not a second class citizen, but something that comes after functions. Because they're certainly the simplest to render. That would be cool. I'd really like to see some modularity improvements in React. So I had alluded to the symlink modules where you install something from npm and it's literally just a common JS import of something from React core.
Yeah.
That seems like a low-hanging fruit, honestly, for React. I would love to see those get migrated out into their respective modules. I think it's honestly just a timing thing. They're going to have to do a version 16, break it, say these are incompatible with prior, and then move on. Yeah. So that would be good. And then the last thing in there...
That gets rid of things like, React secret DOM do not use or you will be fired. Right?
Precisely. And then the last thing is I would love to see, like I'm very interested in Polymer, and obviously Polymer's doing DOM diffing and that kind of stuff as well. I would love to see bidirectional interoperability between React and web components, and they're in Preact web components. I want to be able to see web components that are authored in libraries that can also then be consumed in libraries. And I put in my little notes here. I want to see like the UMD of components.
Yeah,
You just publish as
the magical unicorn of a web component. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, that's our time. Thanks everybody for coming. This has been awesome.
Hey, Jason, thank you so much for being on our show today, man.
Not a problem.
Like I said earlier, it's very clear to me that you've done a lot of deep thinking about a lot of the React, problems and everything. It's been really, really fun having you on the show, man. Hopefully we'll have you again sometime soon and we can dive deeper into some of this stuff.
Cool.
See you, man.
All right. Bye.